Before we dive into the chilling tales, I need you to do something. Turn off the lights, lock the doors, and make sure you're alone. Nurses who work them for years tend to develop a sort of sixth sense about things, small noises in the night, shadows in the corners, or a patient who swears someone visited them when no one else was there. If you ask a nurse to recount a spooky encounter, they'll hesitate for a moment, glance over their shoulder, and then start speaking in hushed tones, as if to keep the dark whispers at bay, because what you're about to hear isn't for the faint of heart. The bustling night shifts grew quieter, the halls emptier. Nurses like Megan, fresh out of training, started taking over the long hours. And that's when the whispers began. Hit that subscribe button if you love a good mystery. And don't forget to leave a comment below if you've ever experienced something that left you questioning the unknown. Her heart skipping a beat. She didn't recognize her, but she could have sworn the woman looked familiar. Now, let's begin. Night shifts at a hospital can be long, and sometimes a little eerie. She turned the handle. She knocked again, but there was no response. She mentioned the woman she saw to her colleague, Linda, who chuckled nervously. It wasn't the first time she had felt like she wasn't alone. She could swear she heard soft footsteps echoing down the hallway, only to turn and see no one there. Then, there were the strange cold spots that would appear out of nowhere in the empty rooms. But it's the stories they tell after hours, when the last shift change has come and gone, that are the most chilling. Megan was walking down the dimly lit hallway when she saw her. We've been hearing strange things about room 301 at first. It seemed like nothing, just her overactive imagination getting the best of her on her first solo shift. But one night, everything changed. And if you listen closely, you might just find that some of these stories sound a little too real. There was no mistaking it. This was the same older nurse from the night before. Her eyes were empty, her face pale and drawn. She didn't speak, she didn't move, she just stood there, watching. Evelyn had worked as a nurse for longer than anyone could remember. She wasn't a hero in the sense of performing life-saving procedures every day, nor did she demand attention. With a shaky breath, she walked closer, hoping the woman would disappear like a trick of the light. She was the kind of nurse who went unnoticed, except for the deep, unwavering kindness she showed to every patient who passed through the hospital. Everyone loved Evelyn. She had a way of making even the worst hospital room feel warm. But when Evelyn retired, the hospital was never quite the same. Megan wasn't sure when it all started. It was late, long after midnight. The hospital was mostly still, save for the rhythmic beeping of machines and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. An older woman, dressed in a faded blue nurse's uniform, walked past her and turned into room 301. Megan froze in place. Must be another nurse from the night shift, Megan muttered to herself. But something about her felt off. She watched the woman disappear behind the door, and after a few seconds, she walked down the hallway and knocked on room 301. No answer. Confused, Megan headed back to the nurse's station. That must have been a ghost. Then, Linda said Megan laughed it off at first, chalking it up to her imagination. But as the night wore on, she began to feel uneasy. The next night, Megan tried to forget what happened, focusing on her duties. But then, she saw her again. This time, the woman was standing at the end of the hallway, staring at her. Megan's heart began to race. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. This wasn't normal, but instead, she felt her breath catch in her throat as the woman spoke, in a voice that was barely a whisper. "You're doing well. But be careful, my dear." Before Megan could respond, the woman was gone. "There's no one here but us," Linda said, shaking her head. "But you might have seen her. The nurses say she's been haunting this place ever since Evelyn retired." Panic surged through Megan. She rushed to the nurses' station and asked Linda about the mysterious woman. But Linda only looked at her with a blank stare. Megan's mind was racing. She needed to know more. So, after her shift, she did some research. She found an old photograph of the hospital's staff, and there, in the back row, was Evelyn. This was Evelyn's old colleague, Zoom1, who had been a constant presence in the hospital and apparently wasn't ready to leave. But she had passed away years ago, long before Megan started working there. She had to face this haunting, whatever it was, and she would do it alone if she had to. But standing beside her, in the same blue uniform, was the woman Megan had seen twice now. But this time, there was a message written on the glass, a message that only Megan could see. It was Evelyn's best friend, a nurse who had worked alongside her for decades. She wanted to scream, to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot. The shadow grew larger as it approached, until it was almost at arm's length. Megan felt a chill run down her spine. The story Linda had told her was true. This wasn't just a ghost. A soft whisper drifted toward her ear. "You're doing well, but you need to leave." But this time, the figure wasn't standing still. It was moving toward her slowly, deliberately. The next night, Megan stood at the nurse's station, her nerves on edge. It was nearing the end of her shift when she saw the shadow at the end of the hallway again. Megan took a step back, her heart pounding. Just as she was about to turn and flee, the figure stopped. Megan froze, the words seeping into her very bones. She turned, bolting down the hallway toward the exit. But as she passed room 301, she couldn't help but glance in. And there, standing by the window, was the woman, her face still pale and lifeless. "You're next." Megan never returned to that hospital again. The hospital had always been a place of healing, a sanctuary for those seeking comfort in times of pain. But for some, it was a place where the line between life and death blurred, where the echoes of the past could never quite be silenced. She was young, bright-eyed, and eager to make a difference in the world. But she hadn't been prepared for the strange things that started happening during her late shifts. It began with subtle occurrences, whispers in the hallways, the feeling of being watched, a door creaking open by itself, but then it escalated. Nurses who worked the night shift often spoke of the things they'd seen, things that couldn't be explained away by science or reason. The moon was full, casting a pale light over everything. Her hair was long and disheveled, her face pale and gaunt. Lena spun around, but the woman was gone. Her heart raced as she tried to steady herself. She wasn't imagining things. She had seen someone. She wasn't alone. She was lost in thought when she suddenly noticed something in the reflection. They all had similar stories, whispers of a woman who had once worked in the hospital decades ago. A nurse who had died under mysterious circumstances, her death never fully explained. Some claimed they saw her walking the halls late at night. Others said they could hear her crying. It was said that her ghost lingered in the hospital, still tending to the patients, still watching over them, just as she had when she was alive. At first she thought it was just a trick of the light, but then the figure appeared again, standing just behind her. The sound seemed to come from one of the rooms, but when Lena pushed the door open, the room was empty. The bed was made, the lights were off, and the only thing that remained was the cold, sterile air that always lingered in the rooms of the hospital. She dismissed it as her imagination, a trick of the mind caused by fatigue. They spoke in hushed voices, glancing over their shoulders as if the ghosts of the hospital might be listening. Lena had only been working at St. Agnes for a few months when she started hearing the stories. It was as if something or someone was watching her every move. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, but the unease settled deep in her chest. One night, as Lena made her rounds through the dimly lit corridors, she heard the faint sound of a woman crying. But the next night it happened again. This time, she followed the sound down a long hallway to a room at the very end. The crying was louder now, mixed with the soft rustle of sheets. As she approached the door, Lena could have sworn she saw a figure standing in the corner of the room, her back turned. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge Lena's presence. Lena hesitated for a moment before opening the door, but when she did, there was no one there. The room was as empty as it had been the night before. Over the next few weeks, Lena began hearing more strange things, footsteps in the halls when no one was around, shadows flickering in her peripheral vision, the faint smell of lavender perfume in the air. One evening, while checking on a patient in room 402, Lena found herself standing in front of a window, staring out into the hospital parking lot. It was a woman, dressed in the same hospital gown that many of the patients wore. Shaq and Lena decided to speak to some of the other nurses about the strange occurrences. Lena didn't know what to believe, but after her own encounters, she couldn't deny that something was happening. She began to feel the weight of the woman's presence in the hospital more and more, until it was as if she was always just out of reach, watching, waiting. One night, as Lena walked past room 307, she saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was the woman again, her face obscured by the long, dark hair hanging in front of her eyes. The woman didn't move as Lena approached, but as Lena drew closer, she felt the air grow colder. Her breath became visible, a chill sweeping through the hall. The touch was enough to send Lena stumbling backward, her mind racing. The woman's form flickered and then disappeared, leaving Lena standing in the hallway, gasping for air. Lena's legs felt heavy, as if she were walking through water. But one thing was certain, There was something in those halls that would never truly leave. And when the night grew late and the hallways grew quiet, Lena could almost hear the soft footsteps of the woman. Still walking the halls, still caring for the patients, still watching over them, just as she had when she was alive. "Who are you?" Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman didn't answer, but as Lena reached out to touch her, the figure turned slowly, revealing a face twisted in sorrow. Her eyes were empty, hollow, as if the life had been drained from them long ago. The woman's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Lena's heart raced, and her body froze in terror. Suddenly, the woman reached out, her cold hand brushing Lena's arm, sending a wave of ice through her body. The next morning, Lena was still shaken. She couldn't explain what had happened, but she knew one thing for sure. The ghost of the nurse was real. It wasn't just a story or a rumor, it was a presence, and it haunted the halls of St. Agnes every night. As the days passed, Lena grew more and more accustomed to the strange occurrences. The ghost seemed to be less threatening, more like a lingering memory of someone who had never truly left. She no longer felt fear, but rather a strange sense of sadness. The woman wasn't out to harm anyone. She was simply stuck, forever bound to the hospital where she had spent her life. Lena learned to coexist with the ghosts. The hospital had its secrets, its shadows, and the nurses knew that some things could never be explained. The night shifts at Willowbrook Hospital were always the quietest, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the occasional beep of a machine or the rustle of a nurse's footsteps. For most of the staff, it was routine, a time to catch up on paperwork, check on the patients, and try to stay awake through the long hours. Her first few shifts were uneventful, just the usual checking vitals, assisting with medication, making sure the patients were as comfortable as possible. But as time passed, she began to notice little things. Anne was heading back down the long corridor toward the nurse's station when she heard a soft, desperate whisper. "Help me." At first, it was just the quiet. It seemed to press in on her from all sides, amplifying every sound, every creak of the old floorboards beneath her feet. And then there were the strange occurrences, whispers that came from nowhere, footsteps that echoed in empty hallways, lights that flickered for no reason. The whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. She had never seen it open before. Her breath caught in her throat as she pushed the door gently. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, but the faint light from the nurse's station behind her barely illuminated the space. The hallway stretched out before her, lined with old rooms that hadn't been used in years. The air smelled musty, stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in ages. Her footsteps echoed in the silence as she walked down the corridor, her mind racing with questions. Who had whispered? What was this place? But for those who had worked there long enough, it was also a time when the hospital revealed its darker side. The whispers had been there from the beginning. Stories passed down through the years from one nurse to the next, but no one had dared speak of it out loud. The room at the end of the corridor stood eerily still. The door cracked open just enough to reveal the dim interior. She took a step closer, but the figure didn't move. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat when she saw the figure standing just inside the room, barely visible in the shadows. The figure was hunched over, but she could tell it was a woman, a nurse, by the faded uniform she wore. Rebecca had only started working at Willowbrook 6 months ago, straight out of nursing school. It was on one of those late shifts that Rebecca first heard the voice. As she stepped closer, the woman slowly raised her head. Her face was pale, too pale, and her eyes were wide and vacant, staring straight through Rebecca as if she didn't even see her. She had just finished checking on her last patient for the night. Rebecca froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down the hallway, but there was no one there. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of the hospital's ventilation system. She followed the voice down the hallway toward the old wing of the hospital, an area that had been closed off for years due to its dilapidated state. The further she walked, the colder the air seemed to get. Her chills settled in her bones, and she had to wrap her arms around herself to stave off the creeping cold. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. It couldn't be, she told herself, but the voice had sounded so real. "Help me." Rebecca turned and began to walk toward the sound, her footsteps hesitant but determined. When she reached the door to the old wing, she was surprised to find it slightly ajar. "Hello." Rebecca called her, voice trembling slightly. "Is anyone there?" There was no response. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to step inside. She stopped at the end of the hall, where a small window overlooked the darkened courtyard outside. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The air around her seemed to grow colder still, and she could see her breath in the dim light. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice thin and hollow. "Help me. I've been waiting." Rebecca took a step back, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. She had to be dreaming, or maybe it was a prank. But the woman's eyes, empty and pleading, held her in place. Without thinking, Rebecca reached out, her fingers brushing the cold wood of the doorframe. As her hand made contact, the room seemed to grow even colder, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides. She tried to pull away, but her hand wouldn't budge. It was as though something unseen was holding her in place, keeping her locked in this room with the woman. The silence was unbearable, thick with dread, before the woman spoke again, her voice barely a breath. "They said I died, but I didn't." The woman's lips moved again, her voice a rasping whisper. "I never left. I couldn't leave." Rebecca couldn't shake the image of the woman's hollow eyes from her mind. But when the shift ended and she went to report to the head nurse, she was met with a strange look. Rebecca's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" she demanded, though her voice wavered with fear. "What happened to you?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a slow step forward, her gaze never leaving Rebecca's. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest. "A tragic accident, but they say she never left." The air was heavy with something cold and suffocating, and the darkness around her seemed to press closer. It was as if the very walls of the hospital were closing in on her. She didn't stop until she had reached the nurse's station, her chest heaving, the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The figure stepped forward again, her presence growing more intense, more real, as though the woman was pulling the life out of the room. "I waited for them," the woman whispered, her voice almost too soft to hear. "But they never came." Rebecca finally pulled her hand free, stumbling backward. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she turned and ran toward the door, not daring to look back. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of half-finished tasks and shaky breaths. "Is something wrong, Rebecca?" the nurse asked. I saw someone," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. "A nurse, in the old wing." The nurse's face hardened. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked, her voice soft and grave. Rebecca nodded, her throat dry. The nurse hesitated, as though unsure whether to speak. Her name was Sarah. She worked here years ago. Rebecca's blood ran cold as the nurse's words hung in the air. "They say she's still waiting for someone to help her." The hospital had always been a place of safety, a place where lives were saved and comfort was offered to the weary. But when the lights dimmed and the patients drifted off to sleep, the building seemed to take on a different unsettling stillness that hung in the air like a shroud. She chalked it up to overactive imaginations, the stress of working long shifts, and the exhaustion that came with caring for the sick. Sarah was assigned to the evening shift in the emergency department, a job she had taken with the hope of gaining experience in the fast-paced world of trauma care. But tonight, the emergency room was eerily calm. No emergencies, no trauma patients, just the dull rhythm of the night. That is, until the night she experienced something that she couldn't ignore. For most of the nurses, it was just another part of the job. There was no answer, only the sound of dragging footsteps. It was as if someone was calling for help, lost, desperate. She reached for the light switch, flicking it on, but the hallway remained dark, as if the light refused to reach the end of the corridor. The sound was coming from the hallway that led to the older, unused section of the hospital, the area that had been closed off for years. She knew there was no one else in that section of the hospital. It was a woman, dressed in a faded white hospital gown, her hair disheveled and hanging loosely around her face. She stood motionless, staring down at the floor, her back turned to Sarah. The woman's presence was cold. Sarah took a step forward, her hand reaching out instinctively, but something stopped her. The rooms had been empty for months. Yet the footsteps continued, echoing through the stillness of the night. Sarah stood there, unsure of what to do next. Her mind raced with logical explanations. Maybe a staff member had gotten lost, or perhaps a patient had wandered into the hallway by mistake. But something told her this wasn't normal. She stood, heart racing, and walked toward the source of the sound. As she neared the hallway, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that she could see her breath in the dim light. The sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct, like footsteps, dragging slowly along the floor. The strange noises, the flickering lights, the feeling of being watched, these were things they had grown accustomed to. But for Sarah, a newly hired nurse, it was all too much. She had heard the stories, the whispers from the other nurses about strange occurrences and things that couldn't be explained. But Sarah was a skeptic. It was a quiet night, the kind where the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of patients in their rooms. She was alone at the nurse's station when it happened. It started as a soft rustling noise, faint at first, like paper being shuffled in the distance. Sarah paused, glancing up from her note. Sarah frowned. "Hello, Sarah," called out, her voice trembling slightly. The footsteps grew louder, now accompanied by a soft, muffled voice, a whispering sound that Sarah couldn't quite make out. "Who's there?" Sarah asked, her pulse quickening. The footsteps stopped abruptly, followed by a strange silence that hung heavy in the air. And then she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, in the dim light, a figure appeared. The woman slowly turned, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman's face was pale, her eyes hollow and vacant, as if there was no life left in them. The temperature around her dropped even further, and she could feel the air thickening, pressing in on her. The hallway, once so full of eerie sounds, was now empty and silent. Sarah stood there for a long moment, trying to catch her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Had she imagined it? Had exhaustion finally gotten the best of her? The woman took a slow step toward her eyes locked on Sarah's, her face frozen in a strange, haunting expression. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, only the faintest whisper. "Help me," it seemed to say, though the words were barely audible. For a moment, Sarah was frozen in place. Suddenly, the woman's form flickered, and in an instant, she was gone. But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. And yet, the air around her was heavy, thick with the presence of something she couldn't quite explain. On the floor, where the woman had stood, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Hesitant, Sarah bent down to pick it up. But a small part of her knew the truth that some things never truly left, and that Willowbrook Hospital would forever be haunted by the spirits of those who had once walked its halls. Every time Sarah passed by the old wing, she felt the pull of something, an invisible force that seemed to draw her in, whispering her name. And every night, as the last shift came to a close, she could hear the footsteps behind her, dragging slowly through the hallways. It was a faded hospital ID badge, the name on it barely legible. The woman she had seen wasn't a ghost. She was a memory, one that had never faded, one that had been waiting for someone to remember. The photo, however, was clear. It was the woman, the same woman Sarah had seen. She heard it again, the dragging footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the old wing. This time, however, they were followed by a voice, soft but distinct, whispering her name. The nurses had told her that Clara Moore never truly left the building, that her ghost still roamed at the halls, waiting for someone to acknowledge her. The badge read, "Nurse Clara Moore, 1982. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had heard the stories of the old nurse who had died mysteriously years ago, a tragic accident that had left her spirit wandering the hospital. As Sarah stood there, holding the ID badge in her hand, she realized something that made her stomach churn with dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. She turned slowly, her breath caught in her throat, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps had stopped. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences only became more frequent. When she left the hospital for good, a part of her was glad to be free of the strange encounters, and the ghost of Nurse Clara Moore would always be waiting for the next person to hear her whisper in the dark. The hospital had always been a place of life, a place where people came to get better, to heal from their wounds. But for some nurses, it was also a place of lingering shadows. It was a hospital steeped in history, one that had stood for over a century, with walls that had witnessed countless births, deaths, and moments of suffering. The only sound in the halls was the soft click of Julia's shoes as she walked down the corridor, making her way toward room 312 to check on a patient. The hallway was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering above her head, casting long shadows against the walls. She had grown accustomed to the stillness of the hospital at night, but tonight it felt different, almost suffocating. It was a place where people's lives crossed paths in strange and sometimes unsettling ways. As she turned to leave, a soft sound from the hallway caught her attention. It was the sound of something. Julia shivered and pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. It was a cold she couldn't explain. She entered the room and found her patient, Mr. Hayes, lying in bed, his eyes closed, breathing softly. But no one spoke of the true darkness that lingered within the halls, not until the night shift. She was about to turn back toward Mr. Hayes' room when she saw it. She could have sworn she heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, as though someone was walking just out of sight. She looked down the length of the hall, but there was no one. It was a woman, tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. Her face was obscured by the dim light, but Julia could see her standing perfectly still, staring down the hallway. Just the flickering lights and the quiet hum of the hospital's air conditioning. Julia, a new nurse fresh out of school, had been assigned to work the night shift in the old wing. "Fine, nurse. Just a little cold. That's all." She had heard the rumors, the stories passed down from one nurse to another, about strange who swore they saw figures in their rooms at night. Maybe it had been her imagination, running wild after hours of exhaustion. Lights that flickered without explanation, and eerie sounds that no one could trace. But Julia was practical. She didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. Julia stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked down the hallway, her mind racing. She was sure she had seen someone, hadn't she? The stories, she thought, were just tales spun by tired, overworked staff. That is, until one night, she found herself facing something she couldn't explain. It was the middle of the night, and the hospital was quieter than usual. As she approached the patient's room, she felt a sudden chill in the air, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. "Everything all right, Mr. Hayes?" Julia asked, gently adjusting the blanket around him. He opened his eyes and gave her a weak smile. Julia adjusted the thermostat, assuming the room was too chilly for him. Julia called out, stepping out of the room and into the hallway. "Anyone there?" But the hallway was empty. Her breath caught in her throat. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to exhaustion. The night shifts were starting to get to her, and she had a lot of work to do. At the far end of the hallway, near the old, unused wing of the hospital, she saw a figure standing in the shadows. "Excuse me," Julia called, her voice shaking slightly. "Are you lost?" The woman didn't answer. She simply stood there, motionless, her head slightly tilted as if listening for something. "Help!" Julia called again, taking a step toward the figure. But as she did, the woman vanished. The figure disappeared into the shadows, as if she had never been there. Doubts began to creep into her mind. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. She turned back toward Mr. Hayes' room, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. But as she walked past the old wing, the temperature dropped again, the chill settling into her bones. She pulled her cardigan tighter, but it did little to stop the cold. Panic set in, and she ran toward the nurse's station, not daring to look back. That was when she heard it again, the soft shuffle of footsteps. But this time, they were right behind her. Julia spun around, but the hallway was empty. Her breath quickened as she walked faster, but the footsteps seemed to follow her, growing louder and closer. When she reached the station, she was out of breath, her heart racing in her chest. One of her colleagues, Karen, looked up from her paperwork and gave her a curious glance. She gazed down the long, empty corridor, then turned back to Julia, her face pale. "You're not the first to see her. You all right?" Karen asked. Julia swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. There's no one there. Julia, the old wing's been closed off for years. No one goes down there. I thought I saw someone in the hall. A nurse, she was standing at the end of the corridor." Karen frowned. Her name was Nurse Anne. She worked here decades ago. She died suddenly, they say. No one really knows how. Some people think she's still here though, still roaming these halls, still trying to finish her shift. But Julia's voice faltered. "I saw her. I swear I did." She had heard the stories from other nurses, their ones whispered in the corners of the break room, but she hadn't believed them. Not until now. Karen stood up and walked toward the window that overlooked the old wing. Julia blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Karen hesitated, looking around to make sure no one else was listening. Julia's stomach dropped as the words settled into her mind. Suddenly, the lights above them flickered, casting the room in an eerie half-light. And then, from the far end of the hallway, came the unmistakable sound of slow footsteps, dragging footsteps coming toward them. Julia's blood ran cold. It was Nurse Anne, and she was coming for her.